Hi, I'm Haley Conda, and today I'm going to be talking to you about lab-grown meat technology, funding, and USDA approval for it. So for our status quo, livestock makes up 1/3 of the world's protein intake. Different countries, of course, specialize in different things, like America specializes in beef, whereas India definitely does not. As for food and meat consumption, the FAO has forecasted that by 2050, 70% more food will be needed to fulfill the demands of a growing population. Also, we will see a rise at least 1% per year and more meat consumption as we see more poor and middle class countries swing into more money, which typically trends towards more meat heavy diets because they can afford it. America is still second highest after Hong Kong in terms of meat consumption, though. As for greenhouse gas emissions, emissions from food production are predicted to rise by 60% by 2050, and livestock emissions are ranked fourth in terms of overall greenhouse gases at around 14.5%. And although these numbers may not be as big as something like transportation, around 27%, there is still research to suggest that agriculture is still a sector that needs to be addressed in order to meet global warming decline goals. The United States is second behind China in terms of overall emissions. Lab-grown meat has FDA approval for health, but not yet USDA approval for sale and marketing. There are other meat alternatives, such as plant-based meat alternatives, that make up about 1.4 of meat sales in US in 2021 alone, with a market value of 14 billion and expected expansion of up to 10% in the next decade. Now on to background. Some of the most well-known startups are Supermeat and Mosa Meat, but we also see more competition with Aleph Farms, Shiok Meats, Beef Tech, Micromeats, and Miatech. We are mostly centered around here in the US and Europe, but there are also other places like Israel who've taken up the mantle. Current cell-growing meat is only successful at a very small scale, as in like a few microns in thickness, which is great for mince, but we can't expect a steak anytime soon. Thicker cell sheets require much more research and testing into the complex workings of different cell types and organizations, and we need to replicate things like blood vessels and more intense forms of scaffolding in order to make that happen. Next, I'm going to go into a short how it's made. First, we take cell from a certain source, typically primary cells taken from the original tissue of the animal. We are also looking into more cell lines, though, which uses induction programs to program the cell to proliferate indefinitely, or we can use spontaneous mutations where the cell expresses immortalized cells. Also, converting somatic cells into induced pluripotent stem cells is a newer option that shows promising developments. Then we take those cells from wherever, we dip them into a culture media to basically, and recipes vary, but we currently see around 10 to 20% of growth media with 0.5 to 2% of fetal calf serum being used to speed up the supplementation growth in the differentiation stage. Some cultures even use chicken embryo extract as well. The serum has alternatives such as AIM5, Sericin, Ultra-Oster G that are also being looked into to lessen the dependency on more animal products, and most of these recipes vary on the type of meat being mimicked. Chicken seems to be the most promising candidate in terms of makeup and complexity. Mimicking in vivo environments is next, so we need to look into scaffolding. Typically, we use animal cells for that have already been made. Bioreactors do all the work in making sure that the growing environment is basically as close to the animal's biome as possible, and then this process can take 2 to 8 weeks depending on the size and type of culture. So Pro 1 is for the environment. There's been studies showing that in theory, cell cultured meat would take up less resources and be less harsh on the environment overall. However, because it is still a relatively new concept that's still in R&D, it's hard to know exactly what those effects would be on a much larger commercial scale. But potentially it would use less water, up to 97%. This statistic is also mostly reliant on the fact that they combine the number of gallons of water for animals as they use to grow crops to feed them. Still, water is water. It would take up less space as agriculture has been put on the hot seat for things like deforestation and take up of land. Cells would be grown in laboratories, with the only expansion needed being for things like facilities to accommodate that, which is much less than an animal may need to graze on. However, it should also be noted that about half the land used for livestock is unusable for agriculture, and therefore not all the land that is lost is a greater use or value to us besides for grazing lands. It would have predictably lower greenhouse gas emissions and probably range somewhere near to chicken, as cows are known to for their addition of methane to the environment. However, this would also be reliant on the fact that we can use these facilities to utilize clean energy instead of fossil fuels, which if we can get that to happen, that would be a big plus for emissions overall in this field. So Pro 2 is on health and safety. Lab cultures do not have the risk of pesticide use, and although antibiotics have been known to be used for contamination purposes, current startups have claimed to have already found ways past this. The culturing takes place in a more controlled environment, meaning we can avoid things like spread of diseases across livestock and prevents contamination typically seen during animal slaughter and rearing. Things like fecal contamination resulting in outbreaks of E. coli and Salmonella, as well as influenza spread through cramped animal environments, majorly impact the fresh processed meat industry. And although there is risk of things like contamination in the cell cultivation process, specific outbreaks like these can be largely mitigated. As an indirect plus, accounting for the amount of growth needed, there's a large pressure on the meat industry, and it can be somewhat alleviated and supported by another meat alternative hitting the market as we attempt to accommodate this rising need. One of the biggest and coolest pluses, I think, is because of the constructive nature of the tech, there is a potential there to convert and add things like omega-3s and iron to make way for personalized diets. We are also looking into things like vitamins and supplementation, as well as adjusting for different fat contents. Currently, the nutrition is not a one-to-one true ratio versus livestock meat, but the potential there for this is very promising. We need to keep in mind the risk of higher rancidity as a result of messing with different properties, though. So Pro 3 is on technological advancements. Cell growth rates can be long and arduous, but thanks to research into fields like this, we found ways to speed up and streamline the process into something that we can then use across multiple fields. Commercially, we would need to see these advancements take place in order to make something like lab-grown meat viable on a commercial scale. And then the advancements can then also be translated onto other things such as lab research and replacement skin grafts and viable organs in the medical field. Another thing we're looking into is scaffolding. So most scaffolding requires animal cells, like I've talked about earlier, but efforts have been made in 3D printing to mimic this. It helps us understand the scaffolding better. Still, animal scaffolding and serums are expensive, so alternatives are the way to go if we want to see this thing work on a larger scale. Then there's also growing agents that we're looking into as an alternative to serums that might have ethical concerns that I'll get into later in the cons, but things like algae and muscle cell alternatives have also been showing great promise in this field. So Con 1 is probably our biggest one. The first lab-grown burger was introduced in 2013 at a price of $330K. And although it's obviously steadily gone down from then, we've already plunged $700 million into 2022 funding already. So it's about how much more money do we need to make this viable? Serum is expensive. It's around $1,000 per liter, and we only use so much of it, but in order to make this viable commercially, a lot is going to have to go into all the chemicals and materials we would need in order for those investments in tech to pay off. It's projected to be around $40 per pound commercially right now, though many startups have already claimed different and cheaper projections in the future. Most of those have not even seemed to meet the ones they've made previously. Other ecologically friendly alternatives are already there, mostly using properties such as mushrooms and soy, and they struggled for years with texture before they were able to make it palatably closer to meat. That being said, if there is already a meat alternative, barring ecological promises, how much do we really need this extra investment? Development time could be higher than consumer need and demand, if there even is one, and it's been said before that it's a slow-growing process, and if we want this to be a food alternative, we need to make sure that it is ready to feed the people with and at the rate that we need it to. We have no guarantee on development timeline that will match up with need and time. There will also be market harm for alterations. Of course, there will be inevitable worker displacements agriculturally and in the meat industry, and we will see commercially for other products a disruption of market value. Effects on current market subsidies and relationships with this new competition introduced may also be seen in the future. So Con 2 is all about consumer approval. There's public approval. It may be lacking in appeal for being unnatural. Sometimes it's hard to sell a burger that will be marketed as full of chemicals, basically, as opposed to an organic, natural grown, grass-fed burger. So in order to make this pay off, we need people to buy it, and if we can't sell it to people because it's unpalatable to them, then this whole thing is kind of useless. We get the tech advancements out of it, sure, but just marketably, it might be a hard sell. Then there's the problem of whether or not it's vegan and vegetarian friendly, again with the use of fetal bovine serums and different cells. If any piece of animal is used, it's not going to be vegan or vegetarian, barring those exceptions that use it maybe for morally conscious reasons, in which case serums would still be down the drain. But if we use a different growing serum, then that could be saved. Then there's also religious controversies. There has been debate in Judaism whether or not most rabbis consider it kosher. In Islam, if it's halal. In Hinduism, vegetarians seem to trend on whether or not it was slaughtered non-violently. And we see a slight appeal here, but cow is still off the menu, obviously. Overall, the amount of people willing to try it on principle is here, but most of the numbers show that there's still a long way to go before we see an actual appeal of the meat overall, compared to people who already make exceptions in their religions. So our final con is on ethics. One of the biggest controversies is the use of fetal bovine serum. Bovine fetuses are taken from pregnant cows by slaughtering the animal, and then we take the fetuses, and to maintain good blood quality, we keep them alive while we drain them out for like 5 minutes. It's been a very big ethical and moral concern across many people, and like I said, even though there are alternatives now, that's the most well-known one, and we know why we use it because it's so useful and it has all the properties made for growing cells really fast. We would need to make sure that that's not something that's being used and that these alternatives can actually be better used. And then there's a problem of whether or not the rich or poor will be targets for it, for the meat itself, whether or not the rich will be the only ones able to buy it. So this will affect how poorer countries can even benefit from this, or poorer areas can even benefit from this. Or eventually if the rich will be the only ones able to afford actual meat, naturally grown. Then there's a lot of environmental impacts and health impacts that are still unknown on a large commercial scale. The use of clean energy would be something that would have to be approved and mandated, and who's to say that would happen? As well, for medical concerns, we don't know the effects for long-term consumption of this. Again, this technology is still unknown, and perhaps the best course of action would be a much slower review process and introduction into the market rather than pushing its approval and funding sooner. It's like, how much of an emergency is this for us? So what I want you to take away from this is not that we're trying to entirely replace livestock meat with lab-grown meats. That'd just be silly, but rather I want you to think about if this is the most effective way to go about this, if we wouldn't be better off directly funding into things like climate change and projections of food necessity and demand problems. But seeing as there's already an interest in this and there's already startups and funding already, if we wouldn't be better off investing in it now and having our thumb in that pie. Thank you.